Welcome everyone to the GTU Women's Studies and Religion first event in their new series, WSR Speaks. We are so happy to have Dr. Inese Radzins, professor of philosophy at California State University Stanislaus, to join us today. Inese has a long history with the GTU WSR program. She was a steering committee member. She was also a co-chair in 2010 to 2011, and then a chair of the program in 2011 to 2012. I am Dr. Ashley Bach. I am the current WSR faculty chair, and I was actually working as the student coordinator at the time when Inese was chair, and it was an honor to work with her and to be mentored by her. She also taught our WSR seminar course in spring 2012. We are also offering our WSR seminar course this spring. It is not currently listed on early registration, but will be up for regular registration. So if you have not taken our seminar course, it will be offered this spring. So just so that everybody knows a little bit about this event series is going to be an opportunity for everyone involved in the community as well as the wider community to just get an idea of some of the interests within women's studies and religion, to be introduced to work that is current and to offer a space for dialogue. So it's not a formal lecture space. The first half will be questions that I will be offering three more broad questions for our speakers. And then the second half will open up for questions. So if you have any questions that come up in the first half, then please do put them in the chat and we'll address those first. And then the second half will just be discussion. So if you used to come to our WSR Cafe series events, it's similar to that. So just a space for us to have conversation about women's studies and religion. So with that, I will begin. So thank you again, Inese, for having this conversation with us today. And I want to open with our first broad question, which is very important and is going to kind of guide all of our events in the series. What are your thoughts on the continued importance of women's studies and religion and philosophy more broadly in this particular time, a time of heightened political and cultural climate discourse, racism, pandemic, global warming, etc., from your perspective as a scholar, professor, and philosopher?
Well, first off, Ashley, thank you for inviting me. And the Women's Studies and Religion program has a dear place in my heart. As Ashley said, I was a part of it when I was teaching at PSR and GTU, and it was really one of the kind of highlights of my time there. So it's nice to see, Ashley, it's nice to see some old faces from my time in Berkeley, and also to welcome a lot of new faces. So again, thank you for having me. I'm just going to get right into answering your question. I'm going to start by talking about where I'm at now and where I'm teaching. So I teach at a Cal State University, which is in the Central Valley. If anyone's familiar with Modesto and Merced area, Turlock is right there. So it's Cal State Stanislaus. It's most of my teaching is to undergraduates, and the majority of my students are first generation, majority Latinx students. I say that because part of my teaching involves teaching philosophy and feminism, existentialism. And this last week in my existentialism course, we read Simone de Beauvoir. And so these young undergraduates, many of them are very enthusiastic. And a number of the students in the class who identify as women told me, I can't believe she was writing this so long ago, because this sounds like my situation today. So I put that as context for how I understand what women's studies as a field still needs to do or still can do socially and politically. So I think it's important to think about where we're at as a society, and where we were at in terms of a number of the concerns that Ashley raised that at least in the United States we're facing. In other parts of the globe, there might be other issues, although similar ones to what we're facing. So I think first of all is the issue of women's studies is still relevant because there are women who are experiencing what my undergraduates labeled. I asked them to put sort of a label or to find names for what they were talking about when they were reading Simone de Beauvoir. And the female students all talked about discrimination or harassment. So they put their experiences as 20-year-olds, many of which happened in the workplace, not as many at the university, in terms of being somehow discriminated against or harassed because of their gender or sexuality. And they understood that in different ways because they're just coming to start using those sorts of terms that for many of you as graduate students might be very kind of normal or everyday common sense, but it isn't for the undergraduates that I'm teaching. So I'm trying to put it in a broader perspective in terms of, I think women's studies is still relevant because the experiences that women are still continuing to have in society. So I'll just give one very concrete example that a student gave, which is she was a manager at her service job at a retail clothing store. And she said, all of the employees who work for me or who I'm managing always question my authority. And when I see them interacting with other male managers, that never happens. So that's just a very sort of concrete example of something that is happening today. I want to set that context because I want to say when I started doing this kind of work in my undergraduate, I thought, oh, it's all going to change and everything's going to be better in the future. And what is really interesting is over the course of time, the stories my students are telling are very similar to the ones that I would have said my peers when I was an undergraduate were telling. So the question is women's studies not doing enough? Are we not doing what we're supposed to do in order to change the curriculum, in order to change the world, in order to change social and political experiences, right? So that's one question to ask. And I want to suggest that I think religious studies and philosophy in particular are two valuable resources that the discipline has. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of, again, Ashley listed some of the political and social concerns of our time. There's racism. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement. We've encountered a pandemic in the last 2 years. We just had the climate summit, global warming. I also want to say, I think that over the course of history, human beings, we have encountered many challenges, right? This is not the only challenging period of our time. So I don't think putting it in terms of we're confronting a catastrophe right now or something that is more than other people have experienced is necessarily the right way of framing it. And I think philosophy and religious studies can often give us perspective on this because a philosophical or religious studies attitude wants to sort of absorb and look at the things that are unseen around us, right? So I think there's an attentiveness when one is considering how one thinks from religious studies or from philosophy, and one is looking at social and political concerns, be those issues of that women's studies are usually concerned with. So you could talk about sex discrimination. It also can address issues of racism, the pandemic, global warming. So I think the question is, what does religious studies and what can religious studies, what can philosophy offer women's studies, right? So how is it that the two work together? And what in particular do they do when they are assessing a particular situation like the one that my students present? And so I think the challenge, or how I like to think about it, is that philosophy and religion allows for a creativity of thought when addressing these sorts of issues or these sorts of problems. So the idea of pushing inquiry is not necessarily a given in all academic circles. So oftentimes when you think of, for example, social sciences often want to present situations or collate, for example, data. So they want to present things to you. They don't always begin with questions about what they are presenting. So I think what's unique both in religious studies and philosophy is the idea that there are values that they are trying to get at that society doesn't necessarily always value. So there's a way of thinking, there's a modality. I think art does this as well, but I'm not going to talk about art because I don't teach it. There's a kind of creativity that comes in thinking with religious studies and thinking from religion and thinking from philosophy that is not common sense, that is not always available in the broader society. So I think there's a kind of creativity of thought that both philosophy and religion bring to experience. And I think that is still valuable precisely because society itself in our social and political problems, the one that the sorts of problems Ashley named, often try to quantify problems, right? They try to say this is the problem X, whether it's sexism, racism, the pandemic. Think about the Virginia governor's race, which was all about schools and do parents have a say in what happens in schools? What often is not asked is, what are these issues themselves? So what happens? What's the dynamic behind why we are still seeing a Me Too movement today? Right. So when I was an undergraduate 30 years ago, I thought, we wouldn't have to be dealing with things like this. Why is it that attitude continues to be perpetuated, or racism in this country, or environmental destruction like we're seeing with global warming? So the question that philosophy and religion asks and can ask and asks very creatively is, why are these dynamics still so prevalent? What is it that brings them about? Because unless you understand the structures behind it, right? This is the whole idea of systemic forms of oppression. Unless you can understand that, there is no way of really encountering it effectively. So understanding kind of how these things permeate into the world is critical, and religion and philosophy, I think, both offer a way of creatively engaging those topics still today. And I'll just give one example, and then I'll let Ashley ask her second question, which is when we think about early feminism, and again, I'm going to reference back to the undergraduates that I was teaching. We were talking about the history of feminism. We were talking about the movement in the 70s. And I asked a lot of the students, I said, what have you heard about feminism? How would you define feminism? And a number of students in the class were like, these are women who hate men, right? So still today, there's this understanding that feminism equals hating men, not by the majority of students, but by probably 25 or 30% of my class of undergraduates. In the discussions in Virginia about critical race theory, right, people characterize critical race theory as something that is problematic, right? That there's a kind of critique of whiteness that isn't supposed to be happening, right? That's wrong. Just like they would characterize feminism as hating men. So I asked the students, I said, where does that come from? What is feminism saying? Or in the example of critical race theory in Virginia, what is it that critical race theory is? Nobody asks that question in the debates or in the conversation, right? It's either you're for or against it, but the people who are against it never say this is what it is, and this is what I disagree with. They don't know what they're disagreeing with because they don't ask what it is. So again, I think religion and philosophy both help us ask, what is it and then consider how to deal with it. And I have much more to say, but I have to stop because and if you all have questions about anything I said, if you want to put them in the chat, right, then
Yes,
Ashley
put
said
them in the chat, and we'll address those first, and then we're at the second half of the event. It's just open for Q&A as well. So yes, thanks for that reminder to everyone. And I'm going to go shift my second question that I was initially going to ask, just actually because of things that you bring up, which is, and I think dovetails into your work with Simone Weil, which is what I see as dovetailing into your discussions around questions and creativity is also how women's studies and religion, as well as philosophy, opens up not only questions, but paths to action, right? So, which is something that you briefly touch on. So it's looking at the world as it is to identify, uncover those systemic issues, creating methods, creating discourse, offering examples of ways in which this meta-narrative around social constructions of race and gender and various systems that we've been enculturated to take for granted as things that have been naturalized that are actually not natural but socially constructed. It asks us to question those constructs, but also I think fuels hope in being able to change those systems, right? Because by identifying them as social constructs, they become something that is changeable rather than something that is a natural and immovable, which it can feel that way. And so to bring that into your work, you're currently working on a project on Simone Weil. And I'd like you to, if you could just tell us about her. And I know that she was an activist. And so I think that dovetails into that, how we take that into action, how we pull that together.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. I also want to say, I think questioning is a form of acting, right? So I think sometimes we, even in the academy, want to separate theory and praxis. And one of my main attractions to Simone Weil is that she refuses that separation. And so in that there is an activity that happens when you question. It is important on its own, right, to do that. And it is equally as important there's a kind of circling that happens, which liberation theology, for example, Latin American liberation theology often has this sort of circle of, what's the name for it? I'm blanking on it. Of like thinking, acting, reflecting, like a hermeneutical circle, I guess. But so the point is that questioning itself is not doing nothing and is not sitting back, because we know that that everyone can question, and that you don't have to be in the university to question, right? You critical thinking can happen. I think oftentimes universities can help. At our best, we can help foster thinking to go deeper. So I want to say, for me, thinking is a kind of action. It's not what produces action. It is an action. So there are different kinds of actions, and each action is also theorized. I think about what I'm going to do if I am organizing a protest, right? So you can't remove the thinking piece of the action either, so that they're of one and the same kind of piece. So what's interesting with Simone Weil is that she is very attuned to her culture at the time and the problems at the time. So the ones she names, 1909 to 1943, were her dates. The two world wars that she was part of, factory workers in France and their poor conditions, French colonialism. She said France cannot claim to be an example to anybody else until it gets rid of its colonies. the rise of Hitler and the kind of what that did to working classes in Germany at the time, or to factory workers at the time. So what is interesting with Weil, though, is she refuses to join any movement. That she's very supportive of movements that are activist, but she refuses to join any of them. And she does this partly because she feels like in order to question and in order to change, you have to remain independent, because any group is going to try to mold you into their ideology. And they might be ideologies you agree with, but they will still try, their allegiance is to the group rather than always to the, she's very skeptical, right? That groups take on a life of their own and groupthink perpetuates itself. So the one thing I wanted to say about, like you mentioned, hope. And another thing that I would say attracts me to Weil is that she is very careful about the possibilities of change. So she does not think we will ever fix everything. And her critique comes from a very a liberal attitude, right? So for her, the problem is not just conservatives or conservatives versus liberals. For her, the problem, one of the problems in society is precisely that we think we can fix everything, that we take a sort of self-righteous attitude and we create programs and bureaucracies and agencies and huge ballooning administrative apparatuses to address every problem. And nothing changes. So we create institutions and clubs and organizations. And then we are interested in building up those institutions, clubs, bureaucracies, organizations, what have you. And they often don't end up addressing the problem or making the change. And so she is very careful to say, I think we can make it less bad, but we're never going to make it paradise. So the hope is to minimize the suffering, and all of her thinking, this is what's really interesting about her. And I think this also links her to women's studies in a way, is to begin from thinking where you are at, right? So what she would always say, why is there suffering and oppression? Everywhere I look, I see suffering and oppression, right? It was different in her time and her place than it is for us, but that's where she begins. And because she's very concerned with the suffering and oppression that she is encountering and seeing in her lifetime, she was also convinced that that change happens very slowly. Even if even with the best intentions, it happens very slowly. We can see that in the history of our country and and racism, I think. I mean, it is super slow, and it's probably slower than most of us would want, I would say. So her point is, instead of sort of hoping for a world without sexism, let's say, you have to, the work is to minimize the problem as you question it or identify it. And it's not because she doesn't want it to change, it's because she feels like if you look at the history of humanity, change is incredibly slow.
Thank you. So my last question is, where do you find, so when you're teaching undergrads and introducing them to
hang out, I'm sorry, there's someone at my door. I don't know what.
That's fine.
Sorry. I will. Sorry, it was my son. He needed the house keys. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I'm wondering if you could share with us, before we open into the questions, where you have found their aha moments, if there have been, if you've found a trend in that, right? So you've discussed in the beginning how you saw that these questions that and experiences that you would have had when you were their age are the same experiences that they're having. Are you seeing also similarities in these aha moments of when it comes to feminism, understanding feminism differently? Also in teaching about, I mean, talking about they and that kind of group, the problems with that group mentality and individual and maintaining individualism. I think feminism had, the history of feminism has had to deal with its own ways in which it's continued its oppressions, right? So we have it's kind of white middle class focus, and now actually this rising of around TERF feminism, so trans exclusionary radical feminism, where there's these identity politics is getting weaponized around really creating strict boundaries that that blur the allyship that that could be maintained in order for more nuanced questions to be said, and for that to lead that action, but also the actions that then that could lead on a more in attacking those systemic oppressions. So I'm wondering about those aha moments, and then also about where they see these identity pieces kind of fitting in.
Yeah, I think the sort of I mean, I think some of the identity piece that you're outlining, you can also see in academia, right? You can see the sort of each discipline becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Taking on a micro discipline or a micro, discipline. And so those are very helpful in many ways. And yet you're also pointing to the fact that in a sense, what Vey was getting at, which is we start to think about our own concerns and we forget the broader goal or the broader concern sometimes, right? So yeah, so that's all I'm going to say about that piece of it. And I think the aha moments come, I mean, again, like I think change does happen. My students, for example, all know students who would identify as non-binary or trans students, right? That's a change, I think, from when I was an undergraduate, right? So I think there are these small, changes that you can see happening. So it's not, they're not afraid to use that language. They're not alienated by it. They're not, so these changes do happen, but they're very small. And I think the aha moments come when you, and I think this is true for any of you who have taught, whether it's in, I mean, it could be in a congregational setting or at a university, or right when somebody's eyes light up and they're like, I had a student last semester who said to me, I never understood that I would have never agreed that women are sort of, he used the language of like second-class citizens in our society. And he said, and I went home and I saw the way my parents treated my sister. They make her do all the housework and I don't have to do any of it. And I asked them why. And this was a particular student who loved the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, right? And he wanted to engage her with me because it had been transformative for him. Right. So that kind of aha moment of the student realizes something about their own life that really matters because he was engaging this really, really creative and monumental work.
Thank you.
I don't know if that was what you meant by aha.
Yeah,
but.
yes, I think it's great. It's yeah, I think it's how we connect it into how our classes and how our these kind of, sometimes when you think about women's studies and religion or philosophy, it can feel very ivory tower and separated from everyday life. And I think that, so that's, yes, that's what I was getting at. How do we, and to share an example of when that clicks for students so that they don't feel like this is just within the theoretical realm and doesn't doesn't really help or illuminate anything in their own lives, and how that connection is made. So I think that was a great example. So we do have a question from Erica in the chat. Does they address the tension between needing change immediately and the reality that it happens slowly? How does she say we should hold that tension?
Yeah, it's a great question, Erica. I can't think of like a direct quote from her that addresses it, but I think the way she would say it is, it's our desire to want to fix something right away. You see a problem and you want to fix. I mean, I have this desire all the time. Like something happens with my I have 2 teenagers, right? And they're like, I don't know how to finish this college essay, right? One of them is applying to college right now. And I want to fix it for them, like, oh, I know how to write, I can do that. And to sort of resist. I mean, in that case, it might work for me to fix it, right? But in most cases, you can't do that, right? And it's unproductive. So to interrogate one's desire, right? Why is it that I think I can fix everything, or why is it that I feel like I can make the change? Or why do I have this desire to see it happen so quickly? Why is it impossible for me to sit with the situation as it is? Like, we're always projecting what we want instead of kind of what we have. And so for Vey, if you're attentive to what is going on right now, to what you have, where you are at, you are less likely to create these sort of false changes or illusions of change. You're not going to live in dreamland of, I'm going to make it all better. Maybe like I did when I was an undergraduate, right? Like, I'm going to fix through feminism, I'm going to fix the whole women's problem, right? So, and she would say, okay, look around you. Is it any better? Is it even fixable, right? It might be treatable. So I think holding the tension is being really honest with oneself. And in her philosophy, many of us don't like being honest with ourselves, right? We'd rather live in the fantasy land of, I want this future without it. And for good reasons, right? We don't want our kids to live in a future full of sexism and racism. And we see the pain that is produced by those systemic sorts of oppressions. So there's good reason for it.
Thank you. Elizabeth has a follow-up question. Related to Erica's question, given that change is slow, how do we know when asking questions is enough? How do we know when that's just lazy and we need to do more?
So can you read or which one is it? I'm sorry, I'm really bad at multitasking. So
it's Elizabeth Pena's question.
Okay.
I'll read it again. Related, while you
you.
think about it, related to Erica's question, given that change is slow, how do we know when asking questions is enough? And how do we know when that's just lazy and we need to do more?
Yeah, I mean, I think for her, you don't do anything without asking a question, right? So the questioning is always a piece of it. So even, thinking of the climate summit right now and the protests that are happening, right? What motivates the protests for the climate summit is precisely, what can I do? Right? It's motivated by a question. So I think some of us might be like, as teachers, professors, pastors, might be more on the developing the questions side. How does one develop productive thinking and constructive thinking and creative thinking? And for me, that's a form of activism. My teaching for me is activism, because I am trying to get students to engage their situation in a new way, in a way that they haven't before. And so I would say that you can't ever get rid of the questions, because if you stop asking, then you're sort of frozen in time. you're unable to creatively engage, right? So I think like the during Black Lives Matter, for example, the way a number of artists engaged the movement, right? There was this kind of really creative process that unfolded because they were asking different kinds of questions than previous activists might have. I mean, it's not that art wasn't engaged before, but in a very public way this last time.
Thank you. Jennifer asked a question. Inez, would you say Wei's work in the factory was an example of how she goes about change, quote unquote change?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that because I think she was trying to learn. So she had always been involved with workers and unions, and she had written for like union magazines, and she had addressed different union rallies. But I think she felt like she had never engaged as a worker. So I think for her, it was in the process of like she understood this was kind of a gap. Like if she's going to be really engaged with workers, she should understand the material conditions of workers. So I think it was more in the learning part of it, because it was, in some ways you could say it was a sort of selfish thing, like I really need to figure out workers, so I'm going to go work in the factory. Of course, it was really hard labor, so there was nothing easy about it. But the idea that she could decide to do it, and she was aware of this, made it different for her. She could have also decided to leave at any point and been okay. She could have returned to a teaching job, or she had, parents who were financially secure. So I think it was one step in her process of figuring, for her, again, what was really important was to understand the underlying conditions of, she would call it power dynamics, which would include things like sexism and racism, and the sorts of things we're talking about with global warming and environmental destruction. So she would put it all under an umbrella of power. So for her, I do think it was a step in understanding, because again, for her, she felt like we don't often understand the root causes of many of our social problems. And this is what leads us to try to create change, but it's false change because it doesn't address the core. It doesn't address the root. And the root problem for her, for much of it, is what she would have called like capitalism or power, right? That there is a power differential, and our whole system, our whole social system supports it. And that power differential produces all of these problems that we're naming today. So she puts them sort of under an umbrella, and her sort of, I just want to get to this because I haven't talked about it, but this is what my book is about, is sort of the response to that. Like how do you answer that? Like what is the change that she wants to see? And for her, the change is structural because it is toppling the way that she understands power, which is, instead of being concerned with money, power, hierarchies, structures that produce oppression, what the way society should be organized is to say, how can we foster the dignity of workers, of a worker? So instead of saying, what's the program we can create to eradicate sexism or to allow women to be equal in society, she would say, how is it that a society can allow each individual to work creatively? That's her question, really. That's like her organizing question and her sort of fix. I don't want to call it a fix because it really would make society less oppressive, not perfect. She acknowledges that. So yeah, that's a long answer, but yeah, going to work in the factory was a part of her discernment process, I think.
Thank you. And also people can raise their hand and ask questions. If you don't have to put it in the chat at this time. So it's, again, this is informal. So if, maybe Inez, for those that don't know much about Vey, you could give us a little bit more. You said when she's active, if you could just give us a little bit of a kind of a sketch. You said that she was teaching and writing, just to give us a little, give some people a little bit of an introduction to Vey.
Yeah, so she was a French thinker, grew up in Paris. So 1909 to 1943 were her dates. And she did study at the kind of Harvard of Paris, the École Normale Supérieure. She was one of the first women to study at that institution when it opened up to women. Simone de Beauvoir was another one right around the same time. They were there at the same time. So she taught philosophy, and she explicitly asked, after she finished her degree, she explicitly asked for a posting in a rural or industrial area. She didn't want to work in Paris because she felt like, you know, that's where all the elite people stay, and they're not in touch with reality, and they're not in touch with people. So she explicitly asked for a posting and worked in a number of different factory towns throughout France, teaching, often at girls' high schools, and teaching philosophy, and then inserting herself in different workers' movements. She also, and what also attracts me to her is, and I think this is also a connection with women's studies, her interests were, she had multiple interests, so very interdisciplinary, right? Religion, philosophy, classics, philology. She loved languages. She taught herself Sanskrit. So there's a kind of interdisciplinarity already in her thinking and in her style. And I appreciate that because I think it shows an engagement, again, with the world or with reality. It's not a disengaged position of simply standing outside and criticizing or pointing to what's wrong. It's really being in the mix of the complicated nature of life.
Thank you. Diane asks, does asking the questions through the lens of religion and philosophy offer a unique path to get to the roots of the issues, offering uniquely transformational growth, as in the example of your student? Would Vey have operated in some extent to this way?
Yeah, I think that what religion and philosophy can give one, and again, I think art does this as well, at its best, is an engagement with, they would call it rootedness, or she would call it something like culture, not like highbrow culture, like just going to the opera or something. That, I mean, that can be a part of it, but culture in terms of what roots life, like what kind of food do we create together? What sorts of families do we have? What kind of songs do we sing? So religion, I think, and philosophy attends to these sorts of, we can call them values or ideas that are not commodified, right? So in our capitalistic world, really global capitalism that dominates everything these days, even academia, there's an idea that the only things that matter are ones that you can count or give a value to, right? You can say how much your education counts by how much you pay for it, for example. And Vey wants to, and I think this is, again, what religious studies or religion and philosophy can do, is to say, not everything is commodifiable, not everything is valuable, not everything can be put in a box and counted or given an objective structure or an objective name. There are cultural and spiritual values that you can't put on an app ever, right? That defy technology, that defy our notions of progress. And that is what, I mean, I think that's what religion and philosophy can do. So asking the question through religion and philosophy is opening up a realm that oftentimes society doesn't see or doesn't want to think about or can't attend to. precisely because they're not monetary values. And we often only think in terms of monetary values.
Thank you. I'm curious about how you feel the self-reflection of Vei's kind of religious or non-religious identity had on her questions, on the formation of the questions, and how and the actions that then is produced by asking those questions.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about Vei is she says that she has always had a religious sensibility. And the way that she names it is, when you ask for bread, you're not given stones. Okay, so it's very non-traditional. She also, in her spiritual autobiography, says she was friends with a number of Catholic priests, and one of them wanted her to get baptized. And she's writing a response to him explaining why she shouldn't get baptized. And she says, "Isn't it possible that God doesn't want me to be baptized? If I felt a calling to be baptized, I would do it. I feel a calling to stay outside. And that's equally a calling." So for her, again, like joining anything, it could be a church, it could be a union, was just inherently problematic, because it would involve some sort of groupthink, and it would ask you to participate in an organization that could end up doing something problematic. So her religion was very kind of nonconformist and not very traditional. She has really fascinating readings of some of the gospel narratives. So she's definitely using Christianity especially, but also Plato and Spinoza and other philosophers, to develop really what we might today call a spirituality, but not a religion. So her formation and her, and I think it's really difficult to speculate about her own spirituality. A number of authors have done this, and I hesitate to do it because it seems to be against what she herself would ever have done. So a lot of people call her, oh, she was a Christian and she really wanted to be baptized, but she wasn't baptized. And on her deathbed, she was baptized. So there are all these debates in the scholarship around her participation. But I think the important thing to say is she was incredibly influenced by Christianity and other religions too. And that was a motivating factor in the sort of activism she advocated for. Because much of her activism was the kind that I'm talking about, which is questioning and writing. She did try to, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I was just, does she not, I thought that she was also Jewish, of Jewish background.
Yes. So
that was, I'm wondering about that engagement as well. Because I didn't see that from what I've read of with Vei, which is obviously minuscule in comparison, there's tensions there that are that I think I do see that influence of Jewish tradition with her, and within grappling with that with action. I mean, Jewish tradition is questioning, I think, is so inherent within Jewish tradition that I think that's that it's like quintessential, I would say, within that, in a way that that in Christian traditions is not as I think as quintessential. I think is more dogmatic, especially in the circles in which Vei was having those conversations. That's more of a dogmatic group mentality rather than the kind of open to difficult questions and to not having specific answers, that the question is really the root of the issue. I see that as really pulling from the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, it's interesting because her parents were both Jewish, but she was raised completely agnostic. She claimed, or was it, I can't remember now if it was her brother has an interesting autobiography that he's written, if it was his work or in hers, but they claimed that they didn't even really know they were Jewish until they were like 8 or 9, and one of their grandmothers talked about keeping kosher or something. So it's really interesting that, and of course that time in France, that may not have been uncommon among us, her parents, like that kind of generation of Jews in France. So it's interesting, and again, there's been much debate and speculation about Weil's relationship also to Judaism, and the way that she sometimes treats and dismisses the Hebrew Bible. So there's a problematic aspect to it as well. But I think that trajectory of constantly questioning is an interesting one, just that you're pointing out. But it's interesting because I think one of her main influences, was there a question about, who influenced Weil's ideas? Can I?
Yes, that's what I was about to direct us to.
So who influenced Weil's ideas, and were they through personal relationships or academic? I wanted to mention one interesting relationship. So she had a number of influences, academic or sort of historical. I mean, the way she talks about like a Plato or even Spinoza sometimes, or Kant, it almost seems like she knew that, right? She's referencing them almost like personal friends. And if you've ever worked on a thinker, and gotten to know them really well, sometimes they do feel really, like a friend, like them. So Emmanuel, he's my friend, or Simone is my, Simone Weil is, I know her well enough because I've studied her work. But so there are the thinkers who have gone ahead of her that she references a lot. Plato, Kant, I want to say Spinoza. He's sort of been underrepresented in her work, although there's a French scholar who's working on a book about Weil and Spinoza. And so I think it's interesting to think about Judaism, because I think her possible relationship to Judaism could be something like Spinoza's was, and their thinking is eerily similar, or eerily there are similar trajectories in their thought. So I can't wait for this book to come out. But then personally, her teachers, so some of whom were fairly famous French philosophers. Alain was a big mentor. So he would have been one of them. So there are a number of figures that she's interacting with, both sort of when she's in high school and then in her early 20s, and as well as her family. She was incredibly close to her family, and the letters that they write back and forth are beautiful correspondences and funny, like jokes that, like if you're interacting with your family and you tell a funny joke, she's writing and sort of, being sarcastic to her brother about something annoying that he said. So there are a number of influences, and one of the, philosophy, the Greeks, and Christianity are big ones. I think Spinoza, and then Marx. My book is working out how she uses Marx to develop her own philosophy of work, or philosophy of labor. So Marx was a big one, and he's not a Marxist in her eyes, and he's not a materialist in her eyes. So it's a very different Marx than we're used to seeing.
Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and we have 5 minutes. So if anybody has any last questions, or Inez, if you have anything that you'd like to kind of final thoughts that you'd like to share with us. Oh, Joy has raised her hand. Joy, you can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Hi, Inez.
Hi, Joy.
I'm just, for those who don't know, Inez was my advisor when I was at PSR. My question is, how do you see Weil's work pointing us towards hope in the future as we confront all the challenges? Since she's sort of outside of conventional religion and faith, and yet was addressing and concerned with the kinds of issues that we're currently subsuming under inequality and racial justice and a number of other things. It sounds like her work was extremely applicable, maybe ahead of a century ahead of time. So is there something hopeful we can take into how we do work in the world from this background?
Yeah, so my initial reaction is sort of, she doesn't offer hope. What she sort of would say is like fortitude, like strength for the day kind of is more the, so there's no or it's a very tempered hope. There was just a book, a colleague or a friend of mine, David Neuheiser, had this book on sort of a more tempered or realistic hope. Maybe it would be something like that, but it's not. And I think it's because she wants to keep the focus on what is right in front of us. And if we hope, we might get detracted from that. So I think it's more of a, fortitude is the word that comes to mind, and I get that from Spinoza actually. So it's not my own. I've been reading Spinoza recently, and I think that's, if you want to look for something like that, that's about all she would give you.
That's helpful.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful note to end on, because we're in the midst of so many compounding crises. It is difficult to rejuvenate our pools of hope. And I think that focusing more on fortitude and getting through the day, getting through the week, the semester, is in a way something that we feel like that's where we need to spend our focus. It also helps us with not getting complacent. So we're at this confluence of events that we don't, as you mentioned in the beginning, we shouldn't be let our anxiety of that cloud how there have been other times of these various events coming together. But we also are at this precipice where I think people are called to ask questions and to a variety of actions, and may we all have the fortitude together to and bravery to continue to ask questions, and to see what actions that leads us to. So thank you so much, Inese, for being here for this conversation. Thank you all for joining us today. This will be on our WSR YouTube page next week. And we will be having one more of these events this semester. We're going to have Dr. Naomi Seidman. We have not picked a date and time yet, but it'll be early December. So please keep that in mind. And we have several events scheduled for the spring. So so we look forward to having you come and join us for these WSR Speaks conversations. So thank you all, and have a wonderful day. May it be full of fortitude to get you through.
Thanks, Ashley. And thank you, everyone. It was great to see a lot of you too.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Take care.
Take care.